The analytics expert for ESPN and FTN Fantasy. It's Aaron Schatz joining us here on the show. And Aaron, I know you've been, still cranking out the content here in the off season, as you guys are wont to do. And I saw that two Bills players made your NFL's most underrated list in terms of, starting 11 for each side of the ball here. So I know you're a numbers guy, so tell us why the numbers indicate to you that these two guys, Taylor Rapp and Christian Benford, are underrated.
Yeah, I didn't quite do a starting 11, but I did do a player at each position. Benford is really good the last couple of years. He was 18th in my coverage DVOA 2 years ago. He was 4th last year, and that involves coverage on every play. So it's measuring not just what you allow per target, but how often you're targeted. So he's not targeted very much, and when he is targeted, he's very good. And I don't think people realize how good Benford is. He's so good that I actually put him on my Defensive Player of the Year ballot last year. I had him 5th, which, is not one, but it's pretty good to be on a ballot. So Rapp is overrated in a different way, underrated in a different way. There's two different ways to be underrated, right? Either you're a good player and people think you're bad, or you're a great player and people just think you're good. Benford is the great player. Rapp is a good player that I think people think is a hole in the lineup for the Bills. But he's a good tackler. He had very few broken tackles last year. He was an important part of the fact that they ranked 7th in the league against deep passes. I think he's less of a hole than fans think. He's not as good as Benford, but I think he's underrated.
When we hear from our coaches, they talk very highly of Taylor Rapp and what he means to the defensive backs unit and the safety unit. When you started digging into some of these stats with Christian Benford and Taylor Rapp, were there any that really stuck out to you that weren't a part of the article?
I think everything that sticks out was in the article, but I know that the Rams coaches talked about Rapp in the same way. Like, he's always been a coach's favorite, I think, at both of his stops.
Right, and that would make sense, which is why he kind of fits the Bills' DNA here and why he was the target of theirs in free agency. When you look at the roster in totality for Buffalo, I know you did some roster hole work too for the teams in the league, and you had like X number one receiver for Buffalo, which you wouldn't be alone in that assessment. But at the same time, I wonder if the way the Bills look at it is we have a guy that might be able to grow into that role in Keon Coleman. That might be overly optimistic in the eyes of some, but let me know where you come down on that.
I think that is how they look at it. And the other thing about this, and having to pick a hole for the Bills for an article I did for ESPN on biggest remaining hole for each team, is there isn't really a guy to fill the hole. There's really no free agent out there. They've decided that Amari Cooper wasn't the right guy last year. And the other wide receiver free agent, Keenan Allen, is not this guy. Keenan Allen is a different guy. They have guys that do what Keenan Allen does. They don't need that. So it's not really a hole they can fix. The only way to fix this hole is for Keon Coleman to mature. And I'm sure that is what they are hoping will happen. And the fact is that as far as holes go, it's not a great big hole because they do have a lot of good receivers that I think you would consider 2 and 3 receivers. They just don't have that number one guy.
Yeah, when we look back at Buffalo's season last year, they went with the everybody eats mantra where everybody is going to be featured in the offense. And Josh Allen kicked off his offseason press conference once he was back in the building wearing a hat that said everybody eats and explaining, hey, this is going to be a part of our offense going forward in 2025. And we've heard Brandon Beane explain that as well. Looking at other teams in the AFC East, a part of this article, for the New York Jets' position of need, you had quarterback. Now, they picked up Justin Fields this offseason to fill that need. Why do you believe that is still a position of need for the Jets?
To quote the movie Clueless, to quote the movie Mean Girls, we need to stop trying to make Fields happen. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's been 4 years, and the best that we've gotten out of him is a third of a season where he's average. It's not going to get better than that, and the Jets don't necessarily have great stuff around him other than, Garrett Wilson. Good running backs. But I don't think Fields is going to suddenly become even an average NFL starting quarterback, let alone an above average one. So that's the biggest hole for the Jets. And it's not one that they're going to fill. I mean, they can't at this point fill that hole. Fields is their guy for this year, and they're going to end up probably drafting a quarterback in a really interesting quarterback draft with 2026, where there are a number of quarterbacks who might go in the first round, depending on what they do this year. They're not necessarily guaranteed, like, these are the guys. Yeah. It's more like there's like 9 guys, and you could end up with 5 or 6 of them going the first round. But right now, we don't know which of those guys that is.
Talking with analytics expert for ESPN and FTN Fantasy, Aaron Schatz, with us. And I want to get back to what you were saying about the Bills receiving corps, because knowing you kind of comb through rosters pretty thoroughly, just the philosophy that the Bills clearly have. It's a philosophical shift since they traded away Stephon Diggs, which was basically, we don't feel we need an alpha, true number one wide receiver. The team led the league in points, counting playoffs last year, without a true number one receiver, whether it's an X outside or a slot guy, whoever you deem it to be. They didn't really have one, and they were fine without it. How many other teams realistically subscribe to that kind of approach in their passing game, if any, in your mind?
Well, I think clearly the Packers do.
Yeah.
Clearly the Packers have just been putting together as much young talent as receivers as possible. And like the Bills, they also tight ends, right? They also have 2 good young tight ends in Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave. So there's no clear number one. The difference, I think, is that there's a feeling that there are a couple of guys in Green Bay who could be number one if they put it all together, including Jaden Reed, who could be an Amon-Ra St. Brown type number one, like a number one as a slot, like a Cooper Kupp type. As opposed to the feeling that the Bills, the only guy who's really like that is Coleman. He's the only guy who has that potential. But Kansas City also doesn't really have a clear number one. I mean, I guess Rashee Rice is that sort of in the slot, or Hollywood Brown on the outside. Neither of them is really number one. So that's another team that also spreads the ball around a lot and also has the tight ends, although Travis Kelce suddenly got old last year. Noah Gray, sort of underrated. People don't really know who he is.
And also with that and the ability for Buffalo's offense to look like an offense that, has different players that are featured at different moments. James Cook was very much a part of the conversation in Buffalo's ability to do that because of what he meant to the running game and his ability to be a pass-catching running back as well. Flipping it to the defense, and one of Buffalo's players that they drafted this season was an edge rusher, Landon Jackson. Now, you had an article come out that was ranking the NFL draft edge rusher projections, and Landon Jackson didn't come in at the top 7, but what are some things that you thought he offered as an edge rusher and why he was a valuable pick in this year's draft?
He comes in pretty well in the projections. So we call the system SackSeer, and it comes out with 2 projections. One is a projection of sacks that incorporates where your draft position is, and the other is a rating that's just based on workouts and college sack and passes defensed production. In the rating, Landon Jackson came out 4th this year. In the projection, he's lower because he was expected to be a 3rd-round pick, and in fact, he was a 3rd-round pick, and those guys aren't going to get the opportunity that the first-round picks are going to get. But in the ratings, he didn't have a ton of production in college, right? He only had 6.5 sacks in his last year. That's not a lot. But what he did was he really, was great at the explosion drills at the combine, had a great 3-cone time. All the drills that we consider as good markers for guys who are going to improve their sack production in the NFL, Landon Jackson did well in those drills. So I think that's a good pick in the 3rd round, and I think you can definitely feel like this guy has got some serious potential.
Last one I've got for you, Aaron, concerns, the surge that we saw in the run game last season across the league. Pass attempts were down on average across the league, slightly, but down nonetheless. Are we expecting that surge in the run game to continue with more teams leaning on it in the way that we saw last year?
I'm going to guess it's a little bit of a one-year blip.
Okay.
That running game's having more success and being used a little bit more is a little bit of a one-year blip. Now, here's the exception to that. As teams become more analytically focused and go for it more often in short yardage, they naturally run the ball more often, in part because running the ball is successful in short yardage, and in part because there's no longer this feeling like you have to get the conversion on the third down, right? There's a feeling like if you can get to 4th and 1, you go. And so therefore on 1st and 2nd, you might be a little bit more likely to run to get you to 3rd and 1 and then 4th and 1. So I think those things sort of impact the idea of running a little bit more. But last year was a little bit of a fluke in that, like, for example, all the older veteran free agent running backs who signed with new teams had these really big years. And it just happened that really good running backs coincided with really good offensive lines. And so you had that kind of rebirth of the running game a little bit. But, it ebbs and flows from year to year.
And what about, the advent of the RPO game, which pretty much everybody uses now, and the ability for quarterbacks to identify light boxes? And, the logic says you got a light box, run the ball.
That's the funny thing, is because we talk about run-pass ratios, and you forget that there's a number of plays, because of RPOs, there's a number of plays that are both, right? They're not called as runs or passes. They're called as RPOs, and you've got the option based on the box. I mean, and even on non-RPOs, you have the option. A lot of quarterbacks have the option to audible into a run if it's a really light box or everything.
Right.
So we try to talk about run-pass ratios, but you're absolutely right that first of all, you have to always consider scrambles as passes because they're not runs, they're passes. And the other thing is, you're right that it's not as strictly obvious what's a run and what's not a run.
All right, you're a fantasy guru, so it's never too early to talk about fantasy football. I know Buffalo goes with the mantra everybody eats, so while they may not have a number one wide receiver on their team like other teams do, are there any players on Buffalo's offense that you're looking at thinking this would be a good pick in your fantasy draft, and why?
Yeah, you know what? Not really, other than Josh Allen, because of the everybody eats idea. I doubt severely that either of their tight ends is going to be a top 12 tight end because they share. None of their wide receivers are going to really stand out because they share. And even James Cook, I don't know if he'll stand out because I would expect to see a little bit more of Ray Davis this year, especially if they move towards the idea that Cook's going to maybe go elsewhere next year. So this is not a great team for fantasy football, as good as the offense is, because everything is spread out throughout the offense, and because you don't draft the left tackle in fantasy football, so you can't be like, he's a really good offensive player, that it's not going to matter to you.
Yeah. So basically, Josh Allen, and then maybe somebody a late round flyer. I guess if you're in a PPR, Khalil Shakir could make some sense, but outside of that, and even then, he's probably a third or fourth.
If you're a Bills fan, you'd rather own your guy, right? Like, if you're gonna who are you going to draft as your last wide receiver? You'd rather root for one of your guys, but none of them stand out.
Yeah,
where people around the country are going to be like, yeah, I want that guy, except Allen, obviously Allen.
Right.
Yeah. Aaron, thanks for the conversation. Appreciate it. Enjoy what downtime you have here in the offseason, because we'll be cranking it back up here before we know it. Thanks very much for the time.
Yeah, we're working on our preseason book, the FTN Football Almanac, which will be out in early July. So there's no rest for the wicked, man.
Yeah.
I'm working hard.
All right. Sounds good, Aaron. We look forward to seeing that. Thanks very much for the time.